Did you know that after the massive success of the Tim Burton Batman movies, Warner Brothers nearly produced a Superman movie directed by Burton and starring Nicolas Cage as the Man of Steel? I couldn't make this stuff up even if I tried. And today, I'm going to tell you all about it in a little segment I like to call Greetings fanboys and fangirls, I'm ERod and I'm the Blockbuster Buster, and welcome to my most requested episode of Legends of Fandom. For those of you who are new, this is a video series in which I discuss fanboy films and shows that were never made. And even though I received over 100 requests to talk about Superman Lives, I was still a little bit apprehensive. Why? Because there's already an amazing documentary telling the full story of this unmade movie's production, which was directed and hosted by Jon Schnepp. Now, the documentary is excellent, I highly recommend it, and for this reason, I do not wish to plagiarize it. So out of respect to Jon Schnepp's work, in this video, I'm going to primarily be doing three things. I'm going to summarize the story of the production, I'm going to talk about the 5 different versions of the script that this movie had before it was canceled, and I will be giving my opinion as a long-term Superman fan along the way. But before I start, once again, I would like to encourage each and every one of you to seek out and watch The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened. Alright, now that that's clear, let me take you back to the late 80s and let's explore the state of the comic book business at that time to provide a little context to this story. This was around the end of the Bronze Age of comics, where we had seen a few mature ideas be introduced to the world of comics, but ultimately wacky high-concept sci-fi still ruled the genre. Then suddenly, without warning, 2 comic books changed the industry forever. And those comics were Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's Watchmen. Both comics presented a deconstruction of the superhero genre, all the while providing a darker, more grounded, edgier tone which made other comic books look like Saturday morning cartoons. These 2 comic book series became massive hits and fans wanted more. So other comic book creators were pressured into writing darker books, and thus began the era of the anti-heroes. But with the surge of popularity of these darker characters came the downfall of the traditional heroes, and beloved characters like Superman saw a decline in popularity and sales. And so, DC Comics developed a plan to revamp the character for a modern age, with the now legendary story, The Death of Superman, in which the Man of Steel meets his demise at the hands of the hulking beast known as Doomsday. On the film side of things, Warner Brothers was experiencing massive success with the Batman franchise, which was adapted into a much darker tone by Tim Burton. So logic would dictate that their next step would be to adapt Superman in the same manner, by using the storyline that ushered the Man of Steel into the modern age, the death of Superman. So pre-production began on a little project that at the time was called Superman Reborn. Version 1. Now, in my research, I could not find the name of the person that wrote the first draft to this script, but if that individual chooses to remain anonymous, I completely understand, because the movie would have gone like this. So basically, Clark Kent is on the verge of confessing his feelings and his secret identity to Lois Lane, but he just can't do it, when suddenly Doomsday attacks. They get into an epic brawl, but ultimately Doomsday mortally wounds Superman. As the Man of Steel is dying in Lois's arms, he confesses his love and his true identity as he dies a hero's death. Now I know what you're thinking, ERod, that doesn't sound that bad. Well, buckle up, because this is when the story goes banana balls. As Superman dies, his life force magically goes inside Lois Lane, impregnates her, then a few days later, she gives birth to a Kryptonian child who instantaneously grows up to 21 years of age. And then, this magical offspring goes on to fight and defeat Doomsday, and assume the mantle of Superman. I think I speak for everyone when I say, holy merciful Zeus, thank God this wasn't made. Shortly after this draft was completed, Jon Peters became the producer of Superman Reborn. Now, before we go any further, I think it's very important that all of you are aware that while Jon Peters might be a very powerful, rich, successful Hollywood producer, the guy is a bit of a meatball.
Rick comes into the art department. He goes, "Man, we just had a meeting with John Peters, and John Dexter, the art director, was trying to explain something to him, and he put me like in a headlock. Man, it hurt."
Yeah, you might want to remember that because we're going to come back to it later. Anyway, one of John Peters' first acts as producer of this movie was, of course, to have the script rewritten, this time by Gregory Poirier.
Version 2.
This was the first draft to use Brainiac as the main antagonist. The story would have centered around Superman not being able to cope with his dual identity, and even attending therapy sessions to find an answer to his internal crisis. Yes, a comic book movie with multiple scenes that would have taken place in a therapist's office. That's awesome. When suddenly Brainiac arrives on Earth on a mission to destroy everything Kryptonian, with Superman being the last remaining trace of the destroyed planet. Brainiac genetically engineers Doomsday to kill Superman, who then succeeds in doing so. Then Superman spends the majority of the second and third act of the movie walking around heaven, debating on whether to come back to Earth or not. Yup, more therapy scenes. But this time in heaven. That's awesome. Eventually, Supes gets bored of being in heaven and just decides to come back to life. Well, that was easy. Initially, he comes back without his powers, but in the end, he magically wills his powers to come back. That was also really easy. Just in time to defeat Brainiac. While this version had lots of good elements to it, like Brainiac being the main antagonist as opposed to a dumb, brainless monster like Doomsday, I am beyond glad that I didn't have to sit through 6 or 7 scenes of Superman having philosophical discussions about his duality and his place in the world. So once again, I am so glad they didn't make this movie. So the film remained in development hell for several years, until 1996, when famed director, writer, and fellow fanboy Kevin Smith offered to write a new draft of the script, after reading the abysmal second draft. Peters agreed to let Smith take a stab at it, with a few minor caveats. Apparently, in this new draft, Peters didn't want Superman to fly, or wear his signature red, yellow, and blue costume.
Things I don't want him to fly, I don't want him in that costume.
None of that's true.
Yes, you did, and you know it, you meatball. It was Kevin Smith's suggestion to do away with the title Superman Reborn, as he felt that it sounded weak. And thus, he began work on the first script to ever bear the title Superman Lives.
Version 3.
Smith's version is the one that most closely follows the events of the death and return of Superman storylines from the comics. In his version, Brainiac remains the villain, but this time he blocks out the sun in order to negate Superman's powers. And while the Man of Steel is growing weaker, Brainiac teams up with Lex Luthor to create Doomsday, who then kills Superman. However, Superman's remains are recovered by the Eradicator, who brings the Man of Steel back to life but without his powers. The Eradicator then replicates Superman's powers synthetically, long enough for Superman to fight Brainiac and Luthor, until his powers eventually return naturally after being re-exposed to sunlight. While Smith's script is not the best Superman story that I've ever read, it does show a lot of love and affection to the source material. It is a story written by a fan for the fans. Smith was innovative in his introduction of the concept of incorporating as many references and cameos from other DC properties into his script. He did so in order to make the movie feel like it was part of a larger universe. This, of course, is a concept that is very commonly used nowadays by the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The most popular example of this from Smith's script is a cameo in which Batman appears on screens all over the city during Superman's funeral, and encourages the people of the world not to lose hope. For this reason, I feel that Kevin Smith's script is a must-read for any true blue Superman fans. Of course, after his initial draft, producer John Peters started to make one dumb suggestion after the other. Hey, when Brainiac is on his way to the Fortress of Solitude, how about he fights a polar bear for no reason? And hey, how about at the end, Superman fights a giant spider cause, why not? Yeah, that's what the death of Superman was all about. A giant spider. This tacked-on suggestion by John Peters is so notorious that Bruce Timm and the DC animated team even referenced it when they adapted the death of Superman into an animated feature called Superman Doomsday, where we actually see Superman fight a giant mechanical spider, and they even went as far as to give Kevin Smith a cameo.
Like we really needed him to bust up a mechanical spider, right? Lame.
Incidentally, after Superman Lives, John Peters went on to produce Wild Wild West for Warner Brothers. And at the end of that movie, guess what? Giant spider! Of course, that movie went on to bomb like a nuclear blast, but that's besides the point. The sweet irony of Kevin Smith's involvement with the project is that he not only came up with the title of the movie, but he was also the one who suggested that Tim Burton should be the director. After all, Burton worked his magic on Batman. Why wouldn't he be able to do the same for Superman? But then, of course, one of Burton's first acts after coming on board as director was to fire Kevin Smith. Yup, Kevin Smith pretty much signed his own death warrant. And of course, when Tim Burton became the director, he brought in his good friend and longtime collaborator Wesley Strick to rewrite the script.
Version 4.
Now, Wesley Strick's script is actually pretty close to Kevin Smith's with a few major differences. For starters, Strick got rid of all the DC Comics references and cameos and put the majority of the focus on Superman's status as an alien and an outsider. Which, let's face it, those are the types of characters that Tim Burton loves to tell stories about. Misfits who just don't fit in. For this reason, Burton was very adamant about Nicolas Cage playing Superman, as he wanted an actor who made it very apparent that Superman was an alien every second that he was on screen. Because while Cage can easily play a larger-than-life hero, Burton was also very confident that Cage could nail the nerdy awkwardness of Clark Kent, who Burton saw as Superman's failed attempt at fitting in, and would come off as more of an alien than Superman. And to be perfectly honest, that is a very legitimately interesting take on the character. Among Strick's other changes to the story, he would have had Superman resurrected and nursed back to health by a robotic companion named Kay, instead of the Eradicator. Kay was supposed to be a robotic nanny that Superman's parents would have provided him to ensure his survival. Not only would Kay resurrect Superman in order to fulfill its directive, but when Superman came back without his powers, Kay would have become a biomechanical suit that would have replicated his abilities in order for him to still be able to fight Brainiac. And the other major change would have been that ultimately Brainiac would betray Lex Luthor and merge with him to become an amalgamated creature referred to in the script as Lexiac. Now, every time I hear somebody talk about this movie, I erroneously hear them give credit to either Wesley Strick or Tim Burton for coming up with the idea of Brainiac and Lex Luthor mashing up together like some kind of a horror monster, when the fact of the matter is that that concept transpired in the comics way before this movie went into production. More specifically, in Superman number 423. Which was part of the seminal storyline Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, which is one of the most famous Superman storylines of all time. Lexiac was also referenced in the finale of Season 4 of Justice League the Animated Series, in which it is revealed that Brainiac had been hiding inside Lex Luthor for years. And yes, the creators of that show have confirmed multiple times that this was a reference to Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, not Superman Lives. Okay, so are we clear on that? Good. Let's move on. Other than Nicolas Cage as Superman, Tim Burton intended to cast Sandra Bullock as Lois Lane, Chris Rock as Jimmy Olsen, I am not kidding, Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor, and yes, that is how he ended up playing Lex Luthor in that Superman movie that everyone loves. And while there were a lot of rumors that Jim Carrey was slated to play Brainiac, Tim Burton has confirmed that his #1 choice to play the cybernetic villain was Christopher Walken. Alright, while I might not be crazy about Nicolas Cage playing Superman, Sandra Bullock as Lois Lane, Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor, and Christopher Walken as Brainiac? That sounds awesome! Unfortunately, Warner Brothers found Wesley Strick's draft of the script to be a little too artsy-fartsy, so they had Tim Burton fire him, and then Warner Brothers brought in veteran screenwriter Dan Gilroy to write a new draft.
Version 5.
Okay, in Gilroy's less artsy and more action-packed version, Brainiac is not only responsible for destroying Krypton, but he also murders Superman's parents right as they are sending baby Superman away on his escape pod. The villain searches for the last son of Krypton for 30 years, until he finally finds him on Earth, where he has grown into the all-powerful protector of humanity. Thus, Brainiac merges with Lex Luthor to use his knowledge and resources to create Doomsday to kill Superman. Brainiac then proceeds to try and destroy Earth the same way that he destroyed Krypton. But of course, Superman is brought back to life by Kay, who is revealed to actually contain the life essence of Superman's parents, and along with Lois Lane, they save the world from nuclear devastation. And thus, the movie ends with Lois revealing to Superman that she is pregnant. Oh, with his naturally conceived child, not with his weird, magical life essence progeny thing. Man, that was weird. Well, as much as it pains me to admit it, the studio was right. This was the best shooting script. Okay, so they had a good director, an adequate shooting script, a decent cast, amazing costumes designed by the real-life Edna Mode, Colleen Atwood. So at this point, you're probably wondering why wasn't this movie made? I can answer that question for you with 3 words: Batman and Robin. At the time, Warner Brothers' latest and greatest comic book movie was a financial and critical bomb. Not to mention that they had several box office flops in a row. This, combined with the fact that the studio was receiving heavy criticism from both comic book fans and creators for casting Nicolas Cage as Superman, that the weight of their recent failure and criticism just became too much to bear. So finally, Warner Brothers caved in and canceled the project. Their official excuse for doing so being that they couldn't afford the monetary risk of producing such an expensive film. At this time, I would like to remind all of you that the very next year they produced the very expensive Wild Wild West, which bombed like a nuclear blast. But that's besides the point. So, how do I feel about all this? Am I glad that Superman Lives wasn't made, or was this a movie that I would have liked to have seen? Yes and no. At least not yet. Look, while I'm sure that Tim Burton would have made a Superman movie that was worth seeing, I don't think it was the right time to come out with a new take on the character. Why? Because the sad fact of the matter is that after all these years, Warner Brothers is yet to produce a definitive Superman movie. Yes, the Richard Donner movies captured the magic and wonder of Superman, but they didn't capture the full scope of Superman's world, or the essence of the character, at least not as fully as the animated series. And the rest of the Superman movies just make the character look lame and one-dimensional. If you don't know what I'm talking about, take a moment to look at the first Batman movie, the first Ninja Turtles movie, or the first Spider-Man movie. Whether you love them or hate them, all of those films contain everything that makes these characters great. So you can point at any of them and say that is the definitive film based on that franchise. Unfortunately, you cannot say that about any of the Superman films. And until the day that we have a definitive Superman movie, I don't think anyone should try and change the property and give the character their own spin, even if that person just so happens to be one of the greatest directors of all time. So that is the story and my opinion of Superman Lives. Now, once again, before I sign off, I would like to recommend Jon Schnepp's documentary to each and every one of you, as well as the direct-to-video special An Evening with Kevin Smith, in which our favorite fanboy turned director goes into detail about all of his misadventures with Superman Lives producer Jon Peters.
If you can't leave, you gotta stick around here and read John the outline. And I said, what do you mean, read John the outline? They said, yeah, he likes to have the outlines read to him by the writer. I said, what do I have, tuck him in when I'm done too?
What a meatball. Anyway, would you like to see me open up another super secret case file in the future and tell you about another unmade oddity? Feel free to let me know in the comments section below, or better yet, give this video a thumbs up. The more thumbs up I get, the more inclined I will be to make more videos like this one in the future. Now, do you know of any unmade fanboy films or shows? Feel free to let me know at erod@inbox.com so I can determine whether they are worthy of being a legend of fandom. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I'm ERod, and I'm the Blockbuster Buster.